George Galloway stormed to victory in the Rochdale by-election last week. We'll be asking if Gorgeous George's return to Parliament is a threat to democracy, to Keir Starmer, or simply a fluke result in the strangest of polls. The great and the good of the north of England came together in Leeds on Friday for the annual Northern Convention. Did the conference breathe new life into the Northern Powerhouse, or has this much trumpeted levelling up project finally run out of steam? And this week, Jeremy, I'll only cut taxes if it's prudent to do so, Hunt, delivers his much anticipated budget. Will this be the moment when the government can finally reset and begin to claw back its 20-point poll deficit? Or is the Conservative Party done? Welcome to the latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
Just a sort of bigoted woman.
Me and my friends sort of used to run through the fields of wheat.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
It will cost.
I know words, I have the best words, but there's no better word than stupid.
So welcome to the Downtown Den Political Podcast. As ever, I'm joined by our political commentator, Jim Hancock. And James, another momentous week. Last 7 days have seen Gorgeous George Galloway return to Parliament to that rather impressive, it has to be said, victory in Rochdale. Despite all of the shenanigans that went on in the seat, there was talk prior to the vote that the Labour candidate, although not official, hadn't campaigned for a few weeks, of course, but his name was still on the ballot paper. And there was a suggestion that perhaps people would just vote Labour anyway. They weren't really aware of what was going on and, you know, all the dramas that had occurred in the run-up to that poll. So just a reminder to listeners, Labour, sort of midway through the campaign, had to suspend its candidate when it emerged, a tape recording of a meeting emerged from last autumn when Azhar Ali, the candidate for that by-election, made some very, very unfortunate anti-Semitic remarks. And as I say, he was suspended, leaving Labour without a candidate for the by-election. And George Galloway, for this new Workers' Party that he's set up, was always going to run a smart campaign anyway, has gone on and stormed to victory. So, James, give me your thoughts on Galloway's victory.
Yes, well, it's obviously confession time in the sense that I did tout on this podcast last week the possibility that people might just traditionally who vote Labour might still vote for him. I was wrong about that. And I think the reason I was wrong was brought out by some vox pops that was done on Friday in Rochdale, where in addition to the predictable support from the Asian community, I was quite struck by the number of white people. I mean, there were elderly white women saying, "Oh, yes, I voted for him. Time for a change." And I think this is the more broadly worrying thing about this for the political parties, because it is a truth that the Workers' Party of Britain cannot field charismatic people like George Galloway in every constituency. But the fact that there's a sort of disillusionment, it's a bit like going back to the Brexit thing, disillusionment and not an inspiration for the Labour Party, people saying they want to change. I think that's possibly a worrying thing. So clearly Galloway got the support of some people in Rochdale who are completely fed up with both the main parties and decided to vote for him. There are other aspects of it. I'll just carry on until you interrupt me. In connection with that disillusionment, the performance of the independent, the businessman, Mr. Tully, coming in second, that was quite interesting. The underperformance of Reform UK, one would have thought that Simon Damchuk would have been the alternative. If you don't like Galloway, you vote for Reform. But they had a setback there. But I think overall we can't make great profound judgments on swings and things like that, because it was a completely abnormal election. And hey presto, could you believe it? You can't make it up. We're likely to get back to normal fairly soon in Blackpool South, where yet another Conservative North West MP is likely to face a recall petition and then a by-election, where we'll be able to test the measures.
There's
just
two Blackpool by-elections, Jim, isn't there? I think South and North.
Well,
potentially,
yes. The North one is still at an earlier stage. Paul Maynard is accused of using campaign funds or parliamentary allowance to support his constituency office. That's under investigation. So potentially that would be yet another one. And it really is a serious problem. I mean, obviously there are Labour examples of.
Let's not move too much away from the subject of Rochdale, because it was a fascinating poll. The result, as you say, brought Galloway fairly comfortable winner. I think he got over 12,000 votes. The runner-up, which was the independent businessman that you've referenced, got around 6,000 on a pretty decent poll. I think it was around 40% turnout, which is decent for a by-election, particularly on a cold February night. And I think there's a couple of observations I'd make, Jim. Firstly, I think we have to call out the snobbishness of people like yourself, who say that electors don't know what the fuck's going on and don't understand and appreciate the machinations of political parties, and therefore they just, like sheep, go into the polling booths in Rochdale and put it off by Azhar Ali's name anyway. Well, that turns out to be a load of crap. And rightly so, and I'm pleased about that at one level, of course. But equally, I think you're downplaying Reform's performance, because 3%, that is an appalling return in a seat where Reform was saying two-horse race, it's the Workers' Party and George Galloway, or Reform and Simon Danchuk. They got absolutely stuffed. They came sixth in that two-horse race, and Danchuk will have had name recognition because he was formerly the MP there, albeit as the Labour candidate. And for me, other than the last set of by-elections, in which I think they polled 13% in one of those particular by-elections, Reform have underperformed, and have underperformed again in this particular contest. So I thought it was a dreadful night for Labour, for the reasons that I'm sure we'll further explore next, but an absolutely atrocious night for Reform, who were then going on about, they sounded like mini Trumps. The election's been stolen. All these postal votes. Oh, there was intimidation during the campaign. Oh, it was awful. What a load of crap. They got absolutely hammered. And so if there was any comfort to be derived from the Conservatives, who finished a respectable third, given the fact that their candidate disappeared on holiday for part of the campaign, then it's Reform's poor performance. That was my take on it, Jim. I thought, Workers' Party have done great in terms of Galloway. I do think it's an aberration. I don't think it'll happen in any other seat, in any other part of the country at the general election. I think all of this nonsense will be lost in the bigger campaign. I don't think he did himself or his party any favours with his victory speech when he said, this is a win for Gaza. No mention there of Rochdale, and that won't have been ignored or gone astray in terms of when those pensioners that you were talking about in Rochdale were saying time for a change. I don't think they'd be welcoming comments such as, oh, this is a win for Gaza. Mrs. Smith, of Rochdale doesn't give, you telling me she cares more about what's happening in Gaza in Rochdale? Well, you're telling me something I don't believe. And as I say, Reform absolutely stuffed.
Yeah, I obviously accept your brickbats about my ignoring the common man. I'm going to fire one back at you now. I have had the advantage over perhaps you. I heard the whole of Galloway's acceptance speech and his long interview with the BBC afterwards. And actually, I don't want to be in a position of defending this man, but he actually mentioned things like the A&E department and how he's going to get that back. I mean, we all know it's not going to happen, but lines about Rochdale used to be a rich town, Manchester's nearby. Why isn't Rochdale enjoying the prosperity? He did address those issues. So to be absolutely accurate, that was the case.
Can I just interrupt you for 1 second there, though, again, Jim, and just try and reflect on the comment that you've just made. He's gone on about returning an A&E department to Rochdale. We, as in the elite, know it's all nonsense, but somehow you're suggesting that the people of Rochdale are stupid enough to take that line. I will put it to you that the thing that people in Rochdale will have thought when hearing the sound bites from that speech, of which the most played was, "This is a win for Gaza," and this puts Keir Starmer on notice, will not have actually impressed those people who may have lent their support to Galloway because of local issues, and they too will not be kidded by this promise of a new A&E unit for Rochdale. They know he's talking rubbish as well.
Well, why did so? I mean, obviously, this Vox Pop is very unrepresentative, but let's presume for a moment, and because of the size of his majority, that he did attract white support. Why did they vote for him?
Because it's a protest vote. They know that he's only going to be there temporarily. It's like a loan signing, isn't it? For football clubs, oh, well, if it works out, it works out. If it doesn't, it doesn't. And they know in 6 to 9 months' time, they're going to be at a general election poll, and they'll be able to select a candidate who, in my opinion anyway, would be far more attuned to the indigenous population's concerns. But I do think, and rightly, absolutely don't blame people from Rochdale for doing this. They have said to the main political parties, and in particular Labour, you've been a disgrace and we are going to give you a bloody nose. It was a protest vote. And, on a Vox Pop, and you've done these things, Jim. So, you run round Rochdale town centre and you interview 50 people and you get a couple of sound bites that you want. But somebody saying, well, it was just a protest vote, I'm not going to vote for him next time. That ain't getting on BBC Northwest tonight because it's not sexy. It's sexy to go, ooh, this could be a real movement and a big switch for change. And people like Galloway could be getting elected all over the country. And by the way, that was reinforced by that very strange performance on Friday evening when Rishi Sunak decides to put his bloody self in front of 10 Downing Street and magnify the whole issue. I thought that was bizarre. But, I mean, let's stick with Rochdale for a second, Jim. Let me ask you what you thought of Reform's performance. Because, I thought that was the one where I was looking at that thinking, they will finish, I thought they'd finish comfortably second. And to get absolutely slaughtered, I think that's a real problem for Tice and co, because the Red Wall seats are the places that they would be targeting in a general election.
Yes, I would just say two things. One is that I think it was such an exceptional by-election that we need to be a little bit careful in making pronouncements about the fortunes of any of the main or sub-main, as in the case of Reform parties. And the other thing was a slightly personal thing is, of course, that Simon Damchuk was the candidate. He had been the Labour MP and had a, good track record in exposing the child abuse scandal in Rochdale. But nevertheless, perhaps the manner of his departure and his personal conduct led to a depression in the vote for him. If Reform had had a different candidate, they might have done better.
That's an interesting point. I had considered that, but I think that it swings and roundabouts. As I mentioned, there'd be name recognition there. So I think that to suggest that Damchuk was the problem for Reform in that seat is probably being a little bit harsh on the candidate. I just wonder whether Reform, again, when they're up against another disruptor, which Galloway is, they find it difficult to break through. Now, in a general election, maybe, as you say, they're not going to have that sort of problem. We talked last week about the Liberal Democrats, and again, where did they finish? Did they finish fifth?
Fifth or sixth, yes. In the
sixth
seat
was reformed, so I'm presuming Lib Dems finished fifth.
Right. But the point is that this was a seat that was held by Smith and then Liz Lynn and then Paul Rowan. It used to be a Liberal Democrat northern sort of bastion, a sign that the Liberals could perform outside the southwest and around London. So, there are some councillors still on Rochdale Council from the Liberal Democrats. I think they suffered particularly, the Lib Dems, from the coalition years in Rochdale. I think that really turned people off. But I don't think Ed Davey visited Rochdale, so they weren't taking it seriously, which is a bit strange. They could have tried to get some votes there, but I just think that they probably thought that it was going to be such a strange election. And again, one wouldn't want to be being over depressed about their performance in Rochdale, but just on that subject, and perhaps we are going to move on now to the Prime Minister's statement in Downing Street, because Ed Davey sort of said, he'd only done that in order to keep the embarrassment of Labour going. My understanding is, as I was at this convention of the North on Friday, and it's always useful because you pick up all sorts of stuff, is that the Prime Minister on Friday received a very serious report on the activities of Galloway's supporters and their intimidatory behaviour. And it was against all other candidates, including, I presume, Mr. Tully and Simon Damchuk. Simon Damchuk didn't attend the count because he was subjected to considerable intimidation and abuse. And that's, I'm told, why the Prime Minister came out, because it was a very strange thing, because he'd actually said all that about 2 days before. And my media colleagues were saying to me on Friday, when we were summoned to attend the Prime Minister who was coming out from Downing Street, I mean, the immediate thought was, is he calling a general election? Is he declaring some intervention in Ukraine or the Middle East? I mean, that's a very serious move by the Prime Minister, and I'm not sure quite where it took us, and I'm not quite sure, apart from the reason I've given, why he did it. I don't know what you made of it.
I thought it was strange. I thought actually he did Labour a favour, because, once you put that lectern outside 10 Downing Street, then people are expecting quite a significant statement to be made. And it was a bit of a damp squib. But of course, throughout the weekend, you would have had this conversation and narrative about a Labour crisis continuing in those red wall seats. And we can have a little chat now, perhaps, about the reason Labour did blow that by-election. And you and I have talked previously about the fact that they rushed into this poll on the basis that they were concerned about Galloway coming into Rochdale, gaining momentum. He's an excellent campaigner, whatever you think about him. Obviously not defending any alleged intimidation, but just generally speaking, Galloway, good campaigner, very good orator, has this ability to get under the skin of voters' gut instincts. And, it was interesting to hear his tactics in Rochdale, which was, in the Muslim-populated areas of Rochdale, a lot of leaflets and literature about the Gaza conflict. In the white areas of Rochdale, if I can put it that way, talking about those local issues that you've raised. And so good campaign, and Labour were concerned about that prior to the poll. So they've rushed into calling the by-election, served the writ quickly before Tony Lloyd was buried. They're campaigning, they're on the ground. And again, Jim, we've said that was a mistake, because obviously they've not perhaps done their due diligence on the candidates, although I'm not sure that tape recording would have emerged until Azhar Ali had been selected as the candidate anyway. So I'm not sure what further due diligence Labour could have done in a sense. But the other thing I'll put to you is, can you imagine if the by-election was, let's say, in 2 weeks' time, and Galloway won anyway, with an official Labour candidate on the ballot paper? Now, that would have been a much bigger problem for Keir Starmer, wouldn't it?
Well, at the convention for the North on Friday, I had the opportunity of talking to some very senior Northwest Labour politicians. And at least two of them said to me that they had advised, when they saw this helter-skelter move to call the by-election, they had tried to advise the London headquarters that if a by-election was held, immediately, or even to address the last point you made, even in March, that it would be all about Gaza. And the sensible thing to do would have been hold it on May the 2nd, when the polls for the local elections are going on, the poll for the mayor of Greater Manchester is going on, and the issue would be diffused to some extent by the issues that surround local elections. And they did not get a hearing. And it was said to me that Starmer's office or the national executive are keeping an incredibly tight control, ironic point in one way, but terribly tight control, not listening to people on the ground. And we've been here before, haven't we, Frank, where they do not take the advice from people on the ground in the Northwest. The other thing is that I picked up was that one of the products of rushing it was that a lot of Asian Labour candidates are being subjected to massive pressure, and I hope one day Azhar Ali talks about this. But the feeling in Leeds on Friday was that if more time had been taken, more examination would have been given to the sort of pressures that perhaps Azhar Ali had been subjected to. And had he, under that pressure, said anything anywhere, and more investigations would have been done. So those are two of the points which I thought were quite interestingly made.
I think it's an excellent point in terms of the by-election being held on the same day as the local elections and the mayoral election in Greater Manchester, because as you rightly say, then the local issues and the things that really do matter to the people of Rochdale would have been more of the agenda than simply the Gaza conflict. And of course, when you've got, because the high profile, particularly the mayoral election, it's a high profile election, and when you're then having to compete for space, and you're not getting the national media attention either, are you? So this nonsense, I did feel, this is a genuine thing, and people may think this has been a little twee, but I genuinely felt sorry for the constituents of Rochdale, because it was not an election about them. It was an election about Galloway wanting to get back at the Labour Party, Simon Danchuk, and Simon and I have, on a personal level get on fine, but it was a very strange campaign, his campaign. Yeah. Again, not really addressing any of the local issues, it didn't seem to me, not on the ground, but it looked as though it was more, again, anti-Galloway, anti-Labour and anti-woke. So again, not really addressing the local issues for the people of Rochdale. And then, listening to Labour Town, and Labour wasn't able, for the reasons that we've rehearsed, able to put a candidate up. So a real, talk about damaging democracy, then there's a great sort of test bed case as to when things go wrong, they can go badly wrong. Just coming back to Sunak's comments, Jim. Where does that take that debate? Because, again, I saw a lot of comments on social media afterwards, Sunak saying this extremism needs to be called out, needs to be stopped. And people saying, well, hang on, mate. Lee Anderson made some fairly extreme remarks himself, your former vice chair, and you won't say it was racist. All you'll say is that he was wrong. And all the ministers that are rolled out onto the television sets and into the radio studios keep trotting out this line, well, Lee Anderson was wrong, but they won't call it out for what it was, which is racist.
Do you know why that is?
Well, I presume because most of the Conservative Party membership think Lee Anderson's a hero and think it was wrong for them even to suspend him. And Rishi Sunak is in a real hole here. Yeah. When he's calling out racism and extremism, we can all get behind that. But then he has to look his party in the mirror, doesn't he? And say, we've got a problem. And part of that problem is the fact that people like the Prime Minister and others within the Conservative Parliamentary Party have been far too lax in calling out the misbehaviour and this sort of agenda of the far right. You said it last week, Jim. Hard to find differences between the reform agenda and the sort of stuff that is being talked about and articulated by Rees-Mogg, by Anderson, and by others on that sort of far right of that parliamentary party. And Sunak is reaping what he sowed, I'm afraid.
Yes, well, there's a sort of an assumption in your question that Sunak can do something about it. If the grassroots of the Conservative Party think that Lee Anderson's, or the majority of the grassroots of the Conservative Party think that Lee Anderson's comments are acceptable, then it shows where the grassroots of the Conservative Party are. And they are heading to be a very different party from the one that we've known up to now. But it leaves the Prime Minister slightly stranded. I have to say also, it's been a very strange week. I mean, it's almost as if the politicians are schizophrenic, because Starmer and Sunak have both complained in the last 7 days about the toxic nature of the dialogue in British politics now. And yet, if you watch Prime Minister's questions last Wednesday, it was an absolute trading back and forth. They both had their scripts ready. They weren't really dialoguing with each other, but Starmer was really just digging in with attacks on Sunak, and of course exposed himself in one sense because he said about former leaders. And of course the Prime Minister was very effectively able to come back and say, well, you supported Jeremy Corbyn, so let's not talk about former leaders like Liz Truss. And I've been talking to quite a lot of MPs and people in the last few weeks, and they have to admit privately that things they say about each other, both in private and sometimes in public, contribute to this. Now, you know, we like robust politics in this country, but I think with social media as well, it's fueled all this, and I think it bodes very ill for the general election campaign if it's going to be conducted along these lines. And there will be a temptation for the Conservative Party in particular, when it's lost the economic argument, it seems to have lost the country on that, to go for the sort of those sort of social issues, and it could be a very difficult election indeed. Just one final thing. George Galloway will take he'll affirm, I imagine, in the House of Commons today. And I think one of the most worried people in the House of Commons, apart from Labour being embarrassed on every occasion that Galloway can raise Gaza, will be the Speaker of the House of Commons, because I think the grandstanding George Galloway will be looking to be suspended from the service of the House as soon as possible. But as we saw last Wednesday, Lindsay Hoyle is a diminished man. I mean, I like Lindsay immensely, but it was very interesting. There was a lot of, because of the toxic nature of the exchanges between Starmer and Sunak, there was a lot of disruption where normally Hoyle would have got up and said, you know, honourable member, why don't you go and calm down and get a cup of tea and all that. And that lovely way in which he controlled the House, didn't say a word last Wednesday. And when he is, I think, inevitably faced with the disruptive tactics of Galloway, I mean, it may be the making of him. He may be able to reassert his authority there, but that's something that I forecast will happen before long.
Yeah, it's a great point, actually, Jim. And, so much went on over the last 7 days, as is the want in these modern times that we're dealing with politically, that we didn't even talk about. Lindsay Hoyle, the week before, he was the story. Last week, it's off the front pages because of everything that's happening. But it's a good point, and Galloway, as we've said, he's a master campaigner. He knows how to get the headlines. He's good with people in your profession. He can phone people up, say, I've got a great story for you. I've got a photo opportunity. He's got the sound bites. He went to America and did a Senate hearing. And ordinarily, you'll see those senators, chew people up. They did it with, what's the owner of Facebook's name, Chris?
Mark Zuckerberg.
Mark Zuckerberg, he went in thinking he was the bee's knees. They absolutely took him apart. Galloway went in and took them apart. He's a performer. I don't like his politics. I don't like the way in which he approaches places like Bradford and Rochdale, which he's got no interest in really. But he knows how to win elections. He knows how to win headlines. And I think you've made a great point. I think the Speaker could have some problem.
Can I just do two more points? I was astonished that Chris Williamson, you may remember him as a Labour MP under, I was actually in Miliband's time to some extent. And it was actually
MP.
Yeah, but he was a shadow local government minister for a short while. He's now deputy. That's right. He's now sort of deputy to Galloway. And he declined to repudiate the support of Nick Griffin for Galloway's anti-Zionist position.
Remind people who Nick Griffin is, Jim.
Nick Griffin is I imagine, still leader of the British National Party, which we don't hear so much about now, probably because Reform are partly doing their business. And Griffin endorsed Galloway because of his stance on Zionism, an anti-Semitic stance. And Williamson declined to repudiate that support. So you've got this extraordinary situation where the ultra-left and the ultra-right could be linking up in a very sinister way.
There's absolutely nothing astonishing about that, James, because there is very little difference between the extreme left and the extreme right. I've said it for years, and I maintain it, and it was proved by that endorsement from Nick Griffin of George Galloway, as you mentioned there. Sorry, you had another point to make.
No, I've forgotten what it was now. Carry on.
Oh, there you go. I'll keep forgetting how old you are, James. Anyway, listen. So the final thing I'm going to ask before we take a short break. In the long term, will Rochdale be seen as an aberration, a one-off, a bit of a fluke, or do you think that the Workers' Party, as George Galloway now calls his organisation, will be able to cause Keir Starmer and the Labour Party damage in a general election campaign?
And no, I don't particularly. This is the one shaft of light in what is a pretty pessimistic. I don't know about you, Frank, but I feel pretty pessimistic about things in the world and in our own country. If you actually look at George Galloway in Bethnal Green and in Bradford West, he didn't retain his seat and he fell out with a lot of his supporters. There is a lot of sort of sectarianism within ultra-left parties, and they tend to fall out with each other. And when it comes to a general election, Galloway, lost his seat. So the precedents for the past are that he will lose his seat. But one other thing I picked up when I was in Leeds at the North Convention of the North was that people I was speaking to, they won't necessarily decide this, said it's essential that the Rochdale Labour Party choose a candidate that they are comfortable with, because it could still be quite a tricky general election after the traumatic experience that the Rochdale Labour Party has gone through. And any suspicion that a Starmer-favoured person could be parachuted in there in the circumstances that have been created would be a huge mistake. So let's watch and see who the candidate might be. Obviously, Paul Warren, the journalist from London, born in Rochdale, wanted the seat. He was actually on Newsnight on Friday night and said he would be interested again. But whether they think a white candidate or an Asian candidate is appropriate, but it was suggested to me that it was essential the Rochdale Labour Party be left to choose their own candidate. Whether people in London will think better, think they know better, we'll have to see. But if they make the wrong choice, it's a possibility that Galloway could break his abysmal track record of actually holding on to these seats that he wins.
Well, that's a different question, Jim, isn't it? That's a question. Can Galloway retain Rochdale? Well, perhaps. I mean, I don't buy that, actually. I think no would be my answer. But it was the wider point as to whether the Workers' Party, which of course was Galloway's threat in his acceptance speech on Thursday evening or the early hours of Friday morning, watch out, Keir Starmer, we're coming for you. Well, I think that's highly unlikely. The one thing I would say, though, as a caveat to that, is the longer we continue to see these atrocious scenes coming from the Middle East and Gaza, the more challenging it does get for Keir Starmer. I'm sorry, Jim, let me just finish this point. And the reason why it's so challenging and difficult is not because of Labour's stance now, which is basically calling for a ceasefire, saying that we need humanitarian aid into Gaza, reaffirming its commitment to a two-state solution. But it goes back to Keir Starmer's initial comment after those Hamas attacks on the 7th of October, when he made a very ill-advised and unfortunate comment to Nick Ferrari on LBC. And he said he gave basically unconditional support to Israel for whatever it wished to do. And from that moment on, Starmer's been on the back foot as far as Gaza's concerned. And he's not quite managed to get in front of the curve since then, has he, Jim?
No, but I think, in fairness to him, I don't think at that time he could have envisaged the scale of slaughter and the overreaction of the Israelis. Two more points. As I understand it, for instance, Wes Streeting and Keir Starmer himself are not facing Workers' Party candidates against them. They've got people who are going to stand against them over the Gaza issue, but I don't think that they are... well, then I know they're not Workers' Party of Britain candidates, and in fact they probably would have some distaste for Galloway. I don't think they're standing on the same platform. And just on this general, it's not. I think there's a lot of confusion about this, and you can say we're on the heads of a pin here, but the Labour Party is still not committed to a permanent ceasefire. They are committed to a temporary ceasefire to allow aid in for, say, 6 weeks. And Galloway and his friends want Labour to commit themselves to a permanent ceasefire. Labour won't do that. And I think they have a point, because that would a permanent ceasefire without a two-state solution, because, it seems very, very difficult at the moment, could mean Hamas restoring themselves in the enclaves that they still hold, and we're back to square one. By the way, another small point, I know we don't want to discuss international affairs, but does the Egyptian government, why do they allow, if they want to be seen as a responsible state, why do they allow all these arms to go through the tunnels on the Rafah border? But anyway, that's probably for another day.
Yes, it's a big issue, and one that we haven't this week at least got time to discuss. We'll perhaps try and get someone who knows a bit more about Middle East politics than you and I do, Jim, on to the podcast in future to discuss what, as I say, is just a shocking situation now. And I take the point that you make. Nobody could have envisaged Israel's reaction and Netanyahu's over-the-top attacks on Gaza, on those poor innocent people that you see in photographs of now, pictures on the TV every single evening. But I think once you say, your support is whatever they want to do. And Nick Ferrari actually did say, didn't he? Made the point, so you can deny them water and food. And at that point, he didn't push back, and he didn't cut. And again, I think this is where, Sunak and Starmer are not instinctive politicians. They have to sort of go away and think about things for a couple of days. And then they say, oh, actually, yeah, I was probably, I needed to be a bit more nuanced there. And we've seen both of them do that in several situations now. And, it does tell you that when we say we don't need bloody politicians in politics, well, when you don't get politicians in politics, and I would, suggest that neither Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak are natural politicians, then you do tend to find some of these situations spiraling out of control, whereas the likes of a George Galloway immediately would have been onto that and saying, no, I'm not giving that sort of level of support to whoever you want to talk about. So it's going to be interesting to see how that issue is dealt with by the government and by the opposition, because it doesn't seem to be getting any better. And what is alarming is that America doesn't seem to be able to influence the Israeli government in the way it once did either. So as I say, it's a subject we haven't got time to really delve into now, but we will come back to it and get somebody who knows a bit more of what they're talking about onto the podcast as well. Right, listen, we're going to come back closer to home after the break. We're going to be talking about that Northern Convention. Jim was there. He can give us his first-hand impressions of what went on in Leeds. And of course, on Wednesday, Jeremy Hunt will be presenting his budget. Will there be tax cuts? And if so, what will the implications for the public sector and public services be? Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. On April the 18th, 2024, Downtown in Business will be hosting our Changemakers Live conference. It's an absolutely fantastic event with an eclectic range of speakers looking at everything innovation, science, tech, health, sport, whole range of topics that we'll be talking about this year. So as I say, April the 18th, it's at the Spine Building in Liverpool. Book your tickets now. Go to our website, all the W's, downtowninbusiness.com, and register for your ticket today. Welcome back to this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast. And if I sounded a little more irate than usual during that first part of this week's programme, it is because I'm very, very upset at what happened in Rochdale and perhaps didn't articulate myself as well as I'd like to. But I was just saying to the guys off that had that been in Skelmersdale, town where I was brought up, then I think I'd have been tempted to throw my own hat in the ring, such was the poor choice that the people of Rochdale had to make. So I'm hoping that we don't have to experience anything as poor for our democracy as that particular contest again. Anyway, my blood pressure has come down somewhat, and we're going to try and have a more nuanced discussion, perhaps, more relaxed conversation about the conference that took place Friday of last week in Leeds. It's the annual Convention of the North. It's an event that I do my very best to avoid, but it's one that Jim goes along to on a regular basis. The great and the good, we're told, of the north of England. The reason I try to avoid it, Jim, is I think I went once and just seemed to me to be a little bit twee, really. People who, an awful lot of talk, not a lot of action. But Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Minister, was in the room on Friday and did make some big announcements. Angela Rayner, the Shadow Minister, gave a speech as well. Tell us what your observations of the day were.
Well, it was obviously an attempt to keep the Northern Powerhouse. I mean, we almost don't use that now. It's sort of levelling up, but to keep the devolution agenda alive. I mean, I think there's a great risk that with all the enormous problems that the country's facing in terms of public services, that devolution will go off the agenda. But what we had from Michael Gove was actually, quite an impressive performance. I mean, he had a speech full of content. It was. Cynics said it was to do with the upcoming general election. It was all sort of sweeteners. There was money for Blackpool, which may not be a coincidence in terms of what's about to happen there. But I mean, significant new devolution deals for West and South Yorkshire and the Liverpool City region, lesser deals for places like Hull and Lancashire. He was working with Leeds on establishing the British Library North and West Yorkshire mass transit system, 31 million for innovation in Liverpool. So it went on and on and on. It was quite an impressive performance. And he even addressed the thorny issue of his relations with the Treasury, because as we know, the Treasury has always been the dark matter in the background of any attempt to devolve power in this country, because they used to have those formulas, to some extent still do, but they have been modified, whereby you said, I'd like to build the Elizabeth line in London. How much will that cost? 25 billion. Oh, yes, we recognise the economic case for that, because you can immediately deliver millions of commuters. We'd like to do a £1 billion project in the northwest of England. Ooh, not sure about the economic viability of that. And that's what always used to do for us. But Gove seems to sort of win some of his battles with the Treasury now. He's convinced they now get it about northern devolution. And we'll see. Shall I go on to...
Did Gove also commit the same sort of trailblazer deal that is now enjoyed by Andy Street in the West Midlands and Andy Burnham in Greater Manchester to Liverpool, West Yorkshire, and other devolved areas as well?
That seems to be the implication, yes. And he also said that about 83% of the country now, or by the there's one or two loose ends to be tied up. I think that probably includes Lancashire's grade 2 devolution or whatever it is. 83% of the country will be covered by elected mayors or combined authorities. So he's saying, that the devolution engine is going on and it is delivering. And Andy Burnham was there and said in evidence of that, obviously the taking into his ownership the buses was evidence that there were gains. So even Andy was saying,
Andy's response to Gove's speech wasn't as positive as Steve Rotherham's. Steve was, I wouldn't say joyous, but he was certainly complimentary about Gove's remarks and will have welcomed, of course, this notion that he will now be getting the same sort of powers and responsibilities as his mate up the M62. So it was an interesting, contrast, the reaction, as I say, from Andy Burnham, who's not getting anything extra, is he? Because Gove's basically saying to the other mayors, well, you're getting the same as him now.
Yes. I think, I think Andy has to recognise that the thing has to be done more broadly across the piece. I think we've still got to look at the actual detail of that. I need to do a bit more research on exactly what's been promised for the Liverpool City region and those other areas. Then we come on to Angela's speech, which was a very political speech for that sort of gathering, because, as you've suggested, it is a gathering of council officials and party councillors, people like that. And she made a very political speech. And
business leaders, Jim.
Yeah. And she made a speech reminding us of her background and she has got a compelling story. I mean, she's done incredibly well from a deprived background to reach the position of deputy leader of the Labour Party. But I'm not sure we needed that at this conference. And I just felt that whereas Gove's, he's in government and can deliver these goodies, but as I thought he addressed the needs of the conference. They wanted what they wanted to hear in practical terms, whereas hers was about her background, general attacks on the Conservative government, and when she was asked about, because Labour are proposing a Take Back Control bill, that's their vehicle for doing devolution, there wasn't a great deal of detail there. And one spectacular thing, which I think is interesting in terms of the caution of Rachel Reeves, and we'll come on to Rachel Reeves in a moment in another connection, is that a lot of people feel that the council tax needs to be reformed. But in response to a question about that, Angela Rayner said, no, she didn't say, well, yes, we'll have to look at that in government. She said, no, council tax reform is not on Labour's agenda. So we'll have to see what happens there. So, a mixed bag, really. They're going to formulate a manifesto, which they'll want to be discussed in the general election, manifesto for devolution for the North, and they will keep that going. So, it was a worthwhile conference. It would have been lovely to have seen. Did you
sense, Jim, at the end of that conference, you were walking out thinking we need to have big flags made for the North of England because we are so coordinated, so together, so united now as the North of England that we've got this huge platform that we can march towards Westminster with post-election and start making demands for greater powers, greater responsibility? Or do you think that the North of England is actually just geographically, it might sort of work when you look on a map, but it's so disparate, isn't it? So diverse that to put the whole of the North into a room and say, right, let's go, guys and girls. I just find it very, very difficult to get my head around what a Northern Powerhouse actually means.
Well, you need to talk to Tracy Brabin, who's emerging alongside Andy Burnham, I think, as one of the big political figures in the North of England, West Yorkshire.
West Yorkshire, yeah.
And she was a very lively sort of person on the platform. She made 2 or 3 appearances, and she was precisely addressing that issue. And she was saying, there is a potential for all working together. She recognized the silo approach that you've hinted at. But for instance, on energy, she was sort of saying, yes, Steve Rotherham can provide the tidal power and Hull can provide the wind farms off the coast, and we can all work together. So I don't want to be too cynical about it, but then maybe I've been carried away by having attended the conference, and you're more distance approach is the one that our listeners should listen to. But I don't think all is lost. But I just think it's going to be a second order issue for an incoming Labour government, and we'll just see what sort of priority. Unless, I mean, I was told that Starmer has been appraised of this and sees devolution as the way of delivering growth. I mean, if he does genuinely see that, then maybe it will be a much more central part of Labour's economic strategy. They may conclude, actually, that perhaps if the north of England working together more closely can take some of the heavy lifting off very difficult decisions that have to be taken in Whitehall, that may be a way forward. We'll have to see.
I mean, I think, listen, the devolution train has left the station, so no government, whoever wins the next election is going to try and put that genie back in the bottle. Oh, a couple of very... a couple of sound bites, I suppose you'd call them there, wouldn't you? In quick succession. I do apologise. So I think there's no question that Labour will continue on that path, and I think there will be additional powers given to combined authorities and elected mayors. But I do think that this artificial boundary that's been drawn, and this thing that we call the Northern Powerhouse, is a little artificial for several reasons. You mentioned Tracy Braben. She came and contributed to our Property and Regeneration conference a couple of weeks ago, and she was talking about that collaboration across the north. In particular, though, you would see the economic driver and opportunity as the link between Manchester and Leeds. Just improving the transport infrastructure for those two cities will give a huge economic boost to the region and to those two cities and everywhere in between. But then Pam Smith, the chief executive of Newcastle, also spoke at that conference, and she was saying that they look more towards Glasgow, Edinburgh, and actually London. It's as easy to get from Newcastle to London as it is to get from Newcastle to Manchester. And she was saying their economic opportunities actually lie by looking further to the north at one level, i.e. Scotland, and then at another level, actually down to London and improving connectivities and connections there. So that's why I'm a little sceptical about this Northern Powerhouse agenda. And if I look at Liverpool and Steve Rotherham, again, the natural instinct is for Steve and Andy to have conversations and collaborate and cooperate and so on. But Liverpool's big opportunity in terms of being a major player and being the key driver is collaboration, cooperation with North Wales and the Welsh government. So I do think, as I say, sometimes we can get sidetracked into conversations about Northern powerhouses when the economic reality perhaps lay in other deals being done and other partnerships being formed.
It's the brand, though, isn't it? Prescott started it with the Northern Way. If you remember, his preferred structure was going to be regional assemblies in Yorkshire, the North East and the North West, with a Northern Way overarching body that would deal with major infrastructure issues. And, I hear what you say. And it took me 2 hours to get over the snow-clad Pennine Hills after Leeds to get over to Cheshire. Just virtually continuous traffic jam. I mean, and then the rails even worse. So I need no convincing of that. We'll have to see. I mean, I hear what you say. I just think there is a really good brand issue in the Northern Way, and so I'll come down on that side of the argument.
Okay, sure, it'll be rebranded if we get a new government, because that's what happens, isn't it? As you say, it was the Northern Way. It was then the Northern Powerhouse. We'll see what Keir and his team come up with if they win. Right, let's move on to final subject of this week, and that's the Chancellor's budget on Wednesday. And it's well trailed for weeks and weeks now that he is determined to deliver tax cuts, but only if it is prudent to do so, James. It will be a very unconservative thing, he said in his television interview round yesterday, to introduce tax cuts that were not properly funded and costed. We've seen the implications of that when Liz Truss and her 49-day reign, and what was it called? The quasi-quartang, what did they call that budget? What was the great term that was used about that anyway?
But I mean, you can just
fucking awful.
Well,
that
you
was
can
the
just
technical term, wasn't it? Tell me what you think is going to happen on Wednesday. Is he going to cut taxes?
I think he will in some respect. I think he's being pulled hard by the right of the party to almost do a Liz Truss. He's been told by the IMF that tax cuts would not be appropriate, so he's got to keep an eye on the markets. But the pressures on him to do it are intense, and that's why. In his search, because the figures have gone up and down, as you know, in his search for money, we've had this extraordinary proposition, and I'm interested in what you think about it, that they might actually do something about non-doms. Now, I wrote in my blog last week that you can be too clever by half in spiking Labour's guns all the time. So I'm not sure that they actually will do that. But if he makes it less generous for people who have big fortunes overseas and don't pay any tax in this country on it, it would make it more awkward for Labour. And then the final thing I want to say about the budget is what I keep on saying, because I'm advised by you and by most economic experts that whatever tax cuts the Chancellor makes, all that Rachel Reeves will be able to say is us too. And I think that is breathtaking, because, it really does remove, it removes any sort of socialism from Labour. It plays to this line that they're all the same, they won't make any difference. But I know you have a different view, so it's going to be a very interesting. I think there will be tax cuts. I mean, one last thing is, of course, it's due to be a 5p increase in fuel duty, the first one since 2011. The Green lobby are looking at that very carefully, because they're saying, that the government's caution over green energy, and they can't spend any money on it, but they can spend 5p a litre relief on motorists. So it's going to be very interesting, highly political budget, and the Chancellor is being pulled in all directions.
Yeah. Kamikaze budget.
Kamikaze, very good.
Yeah, that's what it was. It came to me whilst you were talking. I'm sorry for the laughter as you were reviewing or previewing the budget, Jim. But the idea that the Labour Party is socialist is laughable, I'm afraid. I would argue never really has been, and never will be, really. It's a social democratic party, and that's why it's whenever it's won elections, it's certainly been in that place. But anyway, I digress. In terms of the budget, what will he do? I think he's got to cut taxes for the reason that you were talking about in the first part of the programme. Actually, the Conservative Party has been hijacked by the far right, and they are demanding that taxes are cut. And of course, we do have to remember that taxes at this moment in time are at record high levels. But they haven't, Hunt and Sunak have not got the confidence to explain to their party, to the electorate, why that is the case. And if I was a Conservative, I would be saying we've had the pandemic, we've had war in the Ukraine, biggest war in Europe that we've seen since 1945. We've got geopolitical issues right across the globe. And unfortunately, when those things occur, then we all have to roll our sleeves up and pay a little bit more. Because if we don't, then we will see further decline in the public services that all the polls tell us people care about, whether that be education, whether that be the railways, whether that be the roads, whether that be, of course, the big one, the National Health Service. But in the absence of making that case, and neither Jeremy Hunt or Rishi Sunak seem prepared to do so, then of course he's, again, I'll use the term once more, hung by his own petard. Because he's only been talking since the turn of Christmas, turn of the new year, about cutting taxes. So I think he's got to. I think he's put himself between a rock and a hard place. Now, again, some will suggest that this is all to do with putting the Labour Party in some political difficulty, because if he does cut tax, what does Rachel Reeves do with that? And I do think she will say, OK, we're going to go along with the tax cut. And people can argue whether that is right or wrong. But I don't actually think it's simply to do with, I think it's as much to do with their internal party politics. I think they're going to find it almost impossible to continue to lead that parliamentary party because of that right-wing rump and because of the Conservative Party out in the country if they don't cut taxes on Wednesday, Jim. I don't think it's just about, here you go, Labour, here's another grenade over to you.
Yes, I mean, the Chancellor's way out of it on Kunzberg yesterday in terms of how can you possibly cut taxes when the public services are in need of so much money injection is a well-tried formula. We have heard it before, which is public service reform, cutting down on form filling, cutting red tape. Now, we have heard it so many times before that it doesn't have much credibility, but it does slightly chime with something we've discussed before, which is what I call the Wes Streeting model. Because Wes Streeting has said about the NHS that it's not just a question of pumping money in, it's actually looking at, some of the ridiculous time-wasting procedures, money-wasting procedures. So I think the Chancellor will try and say, I'm going to make these tax cuts, but I'm going to reform public services and we'll save money in that direction. But can I just ask, I don't know, I know it's not my role to ask questions really, but what do you feel about the non-DOMs thing? Do you think he will go for that and try and further embarrass Labour? I mean, they had success over attacking Labour for £28 billion being set aside for green policies. They forced Labour onto the back foot there. Might be tempted to have another go with non-DOMs, which is the only promise. I'll just remind people, they want the money from non-DOMs to give every primary school child a breakfast.
Yeah. I again, how does that play with the Tory right, though, and the party in the country? So you give tax cuts on one hand, and then you close down non-DOM status. By the way, non-DOM status, again, to explain to listeners, is a very unique thing for the UK. We're the only country that offers this facility where you can come into our country and what the bloody hell you like. And unless the income is actually, tell me if I'm wrong here, Jim, but my understanding of non-DOM is if you're making that money in other countries, so if your profits is coming from a business that you're operating in the States, for example, you don't pay tax on that money. That's right.
And that you're non-domiciled. I mean, that's the name of it. Yeah.
So, as I say, it's a unique thing to the UK. My gut instinct would tell me he's not going to do that because he caused himself as many problems with his own party as he would give
and as Kunzberg reminded him, he said only 2 years ago, if you do that, some of the best people that can help the British economy will go and live in Spain.
Yeah, but then they're still paying the same tax if they go to Spain. You don't get a benefit from although I suppose you get the climate. I don't know. I mean, I'm torn with that. I think you could look at it as, gotcha, in terms of looking at the Labour Party and saying, well, where else are you going to get the cash from then? But equally, as I say, how is that going to play with his own party and his own membership and the comments that he's made in the past?
Yeah, I mean, there's just as we wrap this up, and the final point is: can this budget do anything to shift the persistent Labour lead? And if we look at the national insurance cut on January the 6th, that didn't shift the dial at all. It's an open question, and you'll have a view on it, that the British people have just turned against the government, and that this budget, far from being what some of the commentators are saying, it's monumental to affecting the general election, that it could make no damn difference to the general election. The British people's mind is made up, and there is literally nothing the Chancellor can do, or if he presents it in a certain way, and if it does benefit people, it could actually start to move that dial against Labour.
I just get the sense that people do want change. And it's almost whatever the Conservatives do isn't going to be enough anyway. But I do think that we are still in this very strange situation where Labour hasn't sealed the deal. And my fear is that we are going to get to the general election campaign with that being the overall environment and backdrop to that campaign, and we see a really, really low turnout. Labour win, but they win despite themselves and because of the Conservatives. And what that means for a government, some people might say, so what, as long as they win. But, what that means for a new government is not much of a honeymoon period, a lot of cynicism surrounding all politicians. This narrative continues of you're all the same. And if there's no enthusiasm and then no great fanfare of that change when it does happen, then you end up in a situation where in 5 years we're going to be back in the same place, and perhaps worse, because if you have a sort of centre consensual government in power that isn't able to convince people that things are getting better, and the Conservative Party continue on this trajectory to the right, then whereas we've said in previous conversations, well, they'll just go into oblivion because they'll start electing extreme candidates from the right of their party. Well, be careful what you wish for, because actually one of those people could end up as Prime Minister, such as the disillusionment with politics generally in this country. And that, I think, is what's happened in some parts of Europe. I think it's happened to an extent in certain states in America, which is why you've got Trump, favourite to win the presidency there. Yeah, we're not immune from that sort of thing, Jim, are we? So my guess is Labour will win, but unless and until they can start to engender some enthusiasm into the alternative offer that they have, or unless they come into power and really start to be able to motor and turn things around, and Rachel Reeves has got a trick or two up her sleeve that she's not telling us about because she's concerned the Tories will pinch that off them as well, it could be a tough 5 years for Labour if they do win. So nothing that Jeremy Hunt can do on Wednesday, I think, is going to convince people that it's not time for a change, but people are still not convinced what that change should be.
Absolutely excellent. I hope in 2029 that we can play this recording back of what you've just said, because I think it's a very prescient forecast of what might happen in this country, a limp Labour government, and then a conclusion by the electorate. Well, we tried the old Conservative Party, we've tried Labour, and now we need something really different. And it won't come from the left, it'll come from the right. So a very, very good argument there, Frank.
I hope it's a false one, Jim. I hope I'm wrong. And as I say, let's hope that, the West Streeting blueprint, for example, with the health service, I think Bridget Phillipson's coming up with some really solid, radical ideas for education as well. Let's hope that can go across government and it can be more transformative than we're anticipating at this moment in time. And on that note, we will end the latest episode of the Downtown Den Politics podcast. I don't think it was a particularly cheerful one today. I do apologise about that, but we live in serious times, some big challenges going on out there. But next week, let's be back and hopefully we'll have one or two lighter things to be able to discuss. We will, of course, be looking back at that budget that Jeremy Hunt will have delivered by then. We'll have one or two business voices on as well that Jim and I can react to in terms of how they see that budget as far as their day-to-day operations are concerned. And I'll be joining you from the sunny climes of Cannes because it's the Mippen Property Festival, and Downtown and Business will be represented out there organising some events. So if you go into Cannes, if you go into Mippen, please get in touch. We'd love to have a coffee or something else whilst we're over in the south of France. So, James, I'll be speaking to you, as I say, sunny climes next week. Have a great week, mate. It's been good to see you.
Thank you.
I'll catch up with you soon.
Enjoy Cannes.
Enjoy your week, everyone. Thank you.